Hello my lovelies and welcome to the Spirit Tarot YouTube channel. If you are new, welcome back. If you are a returning viewer, I'm Rin, and this video is going to be a VR to Ethony's tarot tag, My Tarot Timeline. And the idea of this is that we look at decks that were pivotal or very influential in our timeline as tarot readers, and just sort of talk about the impact they had on us and our tarot practice and that sort of thing, because it is very important that we learn, grow, and evolve as readers. And looking at our tarot timeline in this way really helps us to see where we've been and where we are and maybe where we're going. So I find it very interesting. I will link Ethony's video in my description box so you can go check out her video, because she is the originator of this tag. So that will be linked below. I am going to do this video so that each deck is its own chapter. So there will be timestamps if you watch the video and then you want to go back and look at a certain deck or know what the name of a certain deck is. You'll be able to easily access that information or skip around in this video if you want to. Because you don't have to go through the timeline linearly with me if you would rather bounce around. It's all good. So I will have chapters, timestamps in the description box for you. Just a reminder that if you haven't already, please subscribe to the channel. It helps me out so much. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, because that helps out so much more. If you have any questions or comments, or you want to talk about your tarot timeline, feel free to leave all of that down in the comments, because I do love to hear from all of you. And without any further ado, let's start diving into my timeline. All right, so my tarot journey began in 1995 when I was 16. Yes, if you do the math, then you can figure out how old I am today. But I'm kind of hoping that you don't want to do the math, because I'm old. But, you'll have that. So my first deck was the original Rider-Waite-Smith deck from the 70s. Again, I started reading in 1995, but if you followed me, you know how I came about this deck. But forgive me for those of you who already know, because this is my tarot timeline, I am going to tell the story. So I apologize if you have already heard this story. But I was 16 in 1995, and I had very conservative parents. Well, my father, at least, was extremely conservative. And these are just a few random cards from the deck. I may have had this in order, seeing as how we have all cups here. But I decided my mother was the less conservative of the two, and so I took a very bold risk and said to my mother that I wanted to start reading tarot. Would I be permitted to purchase a tarot deck? Now, mind you, this is 1995. Things were not what they are today. I had no idea really where I was going to purchase a tarot deck, but I wanted one, and I knew that they existed, so there had to be a way somehow. But the first thing would be getting permission from my parents. So I was sitting on my bed in my room. My mother was at my door for something. And, I have this conversation with her. And so she says, we have a tarot deck, because your father and I had a tarot deck that we would break out at parties and read with our friends before you and your brother were born. And it's just sitting in a drawer. She's like, so I don't have a problem with it, but let me check with your father. If he's okay with it, then you can just have the deck, because we haven't used the deck since before I was born. So they, that time in their life was in the 70s. This deck was purchased in the 70s. So this is the vintage Rider-Waite-Smith deck. So I don't, even though I'm big in deck modification and everything, I don't alter this deck. Haven't altered this deck at all. Won't alter this deck at all, because it is a vintage 1970s Rider-Waite-Smith tarot deck. But lo and behold, my father decided that it would be perfectly okay for me to have their deck. So I think it was a few days later that my mother comes into my room and tosses this deck onto my bed and says, your father said, yeah, sure, you can have it, have fun with it, knock yourself out. And so it came in the if you've seen pictures of this vintage deck, you know that it comes in a yellow tuck box, which is what she gave it to me in. However, that has completely disintegrated by this point. It was in really bad shape, very dog-eared when they gave me the deck, and then for me using the deck and taking the deck in and out of the box, it just completely fell apart. So I keep this in a tarot bag, laying around in my space for my tarot decks, not just laying around like haphazardly. Like, it has its special place where I keep it in with my tarot decks. The thing is, I honestly never read with this deck anymore. So I got this deck in 95, and it would be the only deck that I would have for years. But being completely honest, I had a very hard time reading with this deck. I don't remember how, but somehow I wound up getting a used copy of Waite's Pictorial Key to the Tarot. And so I would use that book to consolidate. I'd use the spreads out of that book and this deck. And I could read with this deck. I can read with this deck to this day. I can read with it much better now as a seasoned tarot reader, but I had a really rough time in the beginning. But this deck, it definitely holds a special place for me because it was, in fact, my very first deck. And I will hold on to it. I will keep it. It will, at some point in time, get passed down to one of my children because it's sort of the family deck, if you will. Seeing as how it was passed down to me, and then I'll pass down to one of them. If I had to guess, it'll probably go to my youngest because my youngest is much more interested in tarot than my oldest child. Just whichever one seems to be most interested in tarot, that's the child that I will pass it down to. But this was my first deck, and like I said, it was really hard. I could do readings with it, but it was very difficult. Now, 20 some years later, I can pick up a Rider-Waite-Smith and read with it. Like I said, I don't read with this specific deck. I've I have stopped reading with any vintage decks that I have, like the actual vintage deck. I'll talk about that again when we get into another deck. But so I don't read with this one, but I do have two Rider-Waite-Smith decks that I do sometimes read with. One is the Radiant Rider-Waite in a tin. I have that as a travel deck. And then I also have the circular edition of the original Tarot 1909, it's called. And I will read with that one. But so this was my first deck in 1995, my beginning to my tarot path. This is probably the most pivotal deck in my personal tarot timeline. So this is the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg. I got this in 2000. So for 5 years, I had the Rider-Waite-Smith, and I was doing my best to work with it. Now, this deck, how I came to find it was back in the day. There was a website. I don't remember the name of it. The website does not exist anymore. It's been gone for years and years and years and years. But you could go on there and you could choose a deck and a spread, and it would do a computer generated reading for you. But it would show you the cards so you could see the artwork of the different decks. Well, I fell in love with this deck, and I don't know if it shows up real well. But you can see this deck has been heavily used. I'm trying to get it to focus. But I think you can see the wear on this deck. So how I came to actually acquiring this deck. Again, and this is all patina on the side of it. This is not an edge deck. This is how much this deck has been used. So I really, really wanted this deck. Now, at that time in 2000, where I lived, pretty much the only option for me for looking to purchase a deck was to go to the local Barnes & Noble. And back in the day like that, they kept them in a case, locked behind the counter. You had to ask an associate or a salesperson, whatever they are called there, to open the case and get a deck for you. You really couldn't like preview them or look at them, but they did not have this particular deck on hand at the Barnes & Noble, and so I was really disappointed because I really did not know how I was going to get it. Back at that time period, yes, if you have the ISBN of a number, you can usually order it from a bookstore. But back in that day, tarot was not seen the way it is today. And even though they had a few tarot books and a few what they called New Age books at the time, it depended on what worker you got. I literally, back in the late 90s, early 2000s, it was more in the early 2000s that I had this happen. But there was a particular bookstore where I lived then, not Barnes & Noble. The bookstore I'm referring to is no longer in business at all. But I went in and I wanted a specific title on paganism. And I went in with the ISBN, and I knew that the company, like, they had access to it, but the salesperson actually refused to sell it, like, to order it for me because of the content that it was. Mind you, I was an adult at this point in time. Like, there was no reason other than the fact that they didn't like paganism, so they refused to order the book. But anyhow, I digress. So eventually, there was a metaphysical store that opened near us, and I happened to be going by, and so I stopped in, and I got to talking with the woman who owned the store, and she was like, well, I can order that deck for you. Give me your information, and when it's available to order, I will order one for you, and then I'll call you to come pick it up. The thing is, she said at that time, and I do not know if this is true or not, but she told me that at that particular time, U.S. Game Systems was only printing this deck once a year. Once a year, they'd print out X amount of copies of this deck, and that was it. I do not know if that is true or not, if she was just blowing smoke, or if that was really the case. So, time and time had gone by since I had given the information. Just one random day, I happened to stop back in the shop again. I figured that since I hadn't heard from her by this point, that I was just like, she wasn't able to order it or what have you, and I just wasn't going to get it. So I go in the shop and I see it in the case for sale. And so I, of course, snatch it up. And she was like, oh my goodness, I'm so glad you came in. She's like, because by the time I ordered it, I misplaced your information, so I couldn't let you know that it was here, and I didn't know what to do. And she's like, talk about synchronicity. She's like, I literally just put this in the case yesterday, and then I happened to waltz in and then was able to purchase this deck. Now, again, I have my reasons for questioning this woman's stories. We moved away from there, and she went out of business. But prior to us moving away, she was still in business, and she had told my mother and I that if we sent her money for some specific products, that she would then ship them to us. And like, we had already agreed on shipping price and everything, right? So my mom sends her the check for the money. She cashed the check for the items. However, we did not know she was already out of business at that point, and we never got the items that we ordered from her. So any stories that she told me are suspect, but the most important thing for me out of all of this is that I got the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg. And this is when tarot clicked for me personally. Once I had this deck, I began to read like a champ. This deck just made so much sense to me. Yeah, you can see this has been heavily used, and I read with this deck. You will see there is a big span of time between now and the next tarot deck that I get. So I read with this deck for about 14 years before getting another tarot deck. That is how connected to this deck I was. And I have since, because this this copy of the deck is so beat up and it is missing a card, but I still used it because it happens to be that the cover card for this deck features like a little small thing of the card that I'm missing. So I just interchanged the title card with the card that was missing and kept using the deck. But I do have a brand spanking new copy that I got like a year or two ago, and when I use this deck in readings, I use the new copy of the deck. But I hold on to this one because this was my original Tarot of St. Petersburg, and it is the deck that I read with for so many years. It is a gorgeous deck. It's copyright. It was published originally in 1992, and it still is in production. You can actually order it from Amazon. It's very easy to get a hold of it now, but it was not back in the day. So this is probably one of, if not the most pivotal decks in my collection, because it is the deck that really made tarot click for me and really got me starting to be on the path of becoming a quality professional reader, because this is the deck that resonated with me and I could just read so much easier. This deck is the first non-tarot deck that I learned to read with. It is the Gypsy Witch Fortune Telling playing card deck. Some of you may recognize it from the back. It's pretty iconic. This deck, as we know it today, was originally published in 1903. There were a couple of versions that were published in the late 1800s that were slightly different, but it has been published, as we know it today, consistently since 1903. Now, this is my brand new copy. This is from US Game Systems. This is what you will get if you order the deck today off of Amazon. But this is not my original copy of the deck. My original copy of the deck is from, I believe, the 1930s. I did some looking into it because there were different publishers from between 1903 and now. US Game Systems has only purchased this deck relatively recently as far as the history of this deck goes. But I do believe the original, the first copy of this deck that I read with, from what I can find, is from the 1930s, which is why that deck has been put away and is in storage, because it is a vintage deck. So the story of how I came into this deck is that my husband's grandmother was quite fond of me because I was nice to her. I'd kind of help her out a little bit. And one of the times my husband was over at her house helping her with something, he saw this deck laying around and he knew that she wasn't using it because by this point her eyesight wasn't so good and he was like, "Hey, Grandma, you know, Rin reads cards. Would you be okay if I gave her this deck? Just so it doesn't go to waste?" And she was like, "Oh yeah, sure, absolutely." So I got the first deck from his grandmother, and that vintage deck, because I didn't really understand how, like, I knew it was an older deck, but I didn't know how vintage it was and the whole history of the deck at the time. So for several years, I did read with the vintage deck. And the vintage deck actually predicted my marriage to my husband. And so this deck for me is important in my tarot timeline for two reasons. One, it is the first non-tarot deck that I learned to read. And two, it predicted my marriage with that old vintage copy. Now, I do a lot of these readings, honestly, in my shop for a long time because of the love and light, sanitized tarot, paganism, and all that, where everything had to be absolutely so positive. It was painful, a lot of spiritual bypassing. People slept on this deck or crapped all over this deck a lot. And so for the longest time, I only used it for personal readings. Maybe if I had some friends over and we were entertaining, I might pull out this deck and do some readings for friends. But I didn't use it professionally for a long time because there are cards. You have to remember, this is old school fortune telling, right? So this doesn't have the esoteric meanings that the tarot does. It's pretty literal and straightforward when you look at it. And there are cards that are absolutely, without a doubt, what people would consider negative. I do make one modification when I read with this deck. In this deck, there is a card that in a certain circumstance, it can predict death. I do not ever predict death in my readings, and so I do take that as metaphorical. I take it to mean an ending rather than literal death. So I do sort of add that modern touch onto it. There's a couple other times where I'll put a little bit more of a modern spin on a card or a specific interpretation as I'm doing a reading, but this is old school fortune telling. This deck came to be in 1903. You have to think about the attitudes of people towards life in general and the attitudes that people had towards fortune telling back that time. And so it very much, when you realize that this deck is from 1903 and put it into that context and look at it through that light, some things that people may find off-putting today at first glance begin to make sense. And you learn to make the deck work for a modern audience. But there really isn't a lot of work required for that, in my personal opinion. People are much more open to, if there's a difficult energy or a negative energy or event that the cards see. My personal style of reading is I don't just go, oh, this bad thing's going to happen, too bad, so sad. If you watch my video on how I view and work with tarot and other divination tools, these are a compass showing us the direction we're going in. If we don't like what we see, we can work to change that. It's not written in stone. And I always try to, if there's a challenging energy or something in a reading, I always try to deliver that in a very kind and gentle way and offer possible solutions or workarounds for the client, so that even though I'm being honest and telling you, hey, there's this obstacle, there's this challenge, but hey, let's work to minimize it, or maybe we can avoid it altogether. And so that is how I approach it. And I do a lot of readings with this deck for clients today. I'm kind of bummed that I didn't start reading professionally with this deck earlier, but at the same time, I don't know that the masses were ready for it earlier. But it is a well-loved reading now, at least for me and my clients. So as I'm switching decks, I realized I don't think I said what year that I got the Gypsy Witch Fortune Telling playing cards deck. That was 2005. And then we are now at 2010. And that is when I started reading with playing cards. Now, who knows what deck I honestly started with? It would have been whatever playing card deck I had laying around the house at the time. That is the beauty of reading playing cards, is that they are something that most of us have ready access to. This happens to be one of my favorite playing card decks today. This vintage look. I like vintage things, if you can't tell. But this is one that I will often grab today when I do playing card readings. I have learned and do playing card readings in several different ways. I learned a 36 card method first, which I honestly don't use anymore. I outgrew that method. It was my preferred method for several years. In fact, there were a few years after I started reading from from 2010 through 2012, I really kind of favored the playing cards over the tarot cards. I started reading professionally as a tarot reader in 2011, so there's overlap here. I was doing professional work with actual tarot cards, but anything else, I was doing a lot of playing card readings. They were my preferred method for anything non-professional that I was doing from that period of time. And I was using that 36 card method that honestly, I probably could not remember the meanings to now, because I got away from that. I learned to read playing cards as tarot cards, which I do have a video on here on the channel. I also learned some other methods, the French playing card method, the Russian playing card method. I have dabbled in the German method. I have dabbled in the Hungarian method. I've done a lot of different methods of playing cards. I don't usually do any of those professionally, just because I don't get a lot of demand for them. So I kind of don't put them in. Once in a while, I will offer some of the French readings in my shop because I love to do them, but I don't get a lot of call for them. I don't find a lot of demand for it. So it's more or less oh man, I really want to do some French readings. And so I'll offer it and maybe get a reading or two. They just don't seem, at least with my demographic, they just don't seem to be in high demand, but I do love to do them. And I'll do a lot of them for personal readings, or if a friend's hey, want to hang out and do something? And I'm yeah, sure. Let me bring, a deck of cards and, we can have some fun. But it was very pivotal for me. in learning to expand how I read and learning different reading styles. So it was in this year, 2010, roundabout, that I started reading with playing cards. And like I said, for a little while, I was really heavy for personal readings into the playing cards over the tarot cards for personal use, if that makes sense. But all right, on to the next. This is the Tarot of the Hidden Realms. This deck I picked up in 2017. So I am skipping an important deck here. In 2014, I was gifted from a friend the Mystic Dreamer Tarot. I do not have it anymore. Last year, I just felt the right thing to do was to gift it to somebody else because I had sort of outgrown it. I wasn't using it, and it just felt like it was time for that deck to move on. So I'm just going to mention it, but I don't have the deck anymore to show you. But that was the first I read with the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg from 2000 when I got it until 2014 when I got that Mystic Dreamer Tarot. That was the first new deck I had in 14 years. It was the first time that it felt right to start reading with something else. But the next pivotal tarot deck, I picked this up in 2017, and man, this was my workhorse deck for a long time. I really, really fell in love with this deck. In my paganism, I tend to follow a predominantly Celtic path, and this shows the Fae as the Celts thought of them in their writing and lore and everything. So it really resonated very highly with me. I should probably cover that card up pretty quick so that YouTube doesn't get upset with me. This deck is just gorgeous. It is a Llewellyn deck, so a lot of people look down on it because they don't like Llewellyn cardstock. I don't have an issue with Llewellyn cardstock because I overhand shuffle. Let's see if I can move these, not easily. I overhand shuffle. So thinner cardstock is not an issue for me because it will hold up to how I shuffle. I mean, you can see I've had this deck since 2017, and for a couple of years, it was really my workhorse deck. I used it for a majority of my personal and professional readings, and it's still in pretty good shape. I did edge the deck with like a lavender, to sort of a dusky lavender to go with the backs of the decks. But this was just another evolution in my tarot practice. And you can see with the Russian Tarot of St. Petersburg, while it is different than the Rider-Waite-Smith, it is the Rider-Waite-Smith system, and the artwork is very similar to it's a Russian folk art version of the Rider-Waite-Smith. So it was different enough from the Rider-Waite-Smith that I could connect with it and use it and take off as a reader, but it wasn't too different. This is, you know, probably one of the decks that deviated the most from the Rider-Waite-Smith, but I could easily just pick it up and read with it. So this was definitely just a point in my tarot journey where I realized that I didn't have to stick to something that was very traditional to the Rider-Waite-Smith, that I could go with something that had very different artwork on it, and I could learn to grow and expand as a reader and how I interpreted the cards. So we're still in 2017, but this is the first Oracle deck I ever had. Now, some people will say that the Gypsy Witch fortune telling cards are an Oracle deck, and I kind of think they're their own kind of thing. They're kind of an Oracle deck, but kind of not. I think they're their own unique system, more Lenormand-like than anything. But this is the first, when you think Oracle deck, this is the first Oracle deck that I own. This is also the first deck that I ever modified. So I did show you that I had edged the Tarot of the Hidden Realms, but I actually did that with that deck after I modified this deck. So I edged the deck in black, and I also, if you're familiar with this deck as it comes, you know that there's like a double border around the cards. I found that distracting and like it took away from the artwork of the deck, and so I trimmed the borders off. But this was my first oracle deck. And honestly, how I came about this, at the time there was a Facebook group where you could go on and do deck trades. And so I had another tarot deck that I was not reading with because I did not like to read with pip decks. Still, pip decks are not my favorite, but I have a couple that I do read with, but they're not my preference. I like fully illustrated decks. But I had a pip deck that I wasn't using, and I traded it for the Halloween Oracle. It was the one and only time I did a trade on that group, and I do believe that group is absolutely gone now. I don't think it exists on Facebook anymore. But this is the first deck, the first Oracle deck that I ever had. It's also the first deck that I ever modified. I am very into Halloween. Halloween is a way of life, not a single day of the year. I love my spooky readings. I love my Halloween Oracle. Business-wise, I generally only break this out in the fall, but for personal readings, sometimes I will grab this deck year-round and use it. It's gorgeous. It's wonderful. It's Halloween. It's fun. I love it. So now we are at 2019, and that is when I got my first Lenormand deck and learned how to use Lenormand. Now it is, I guess I should say the Gypsy Witch fortune-telling cards are similar to Lenormand because the Lenormand deck did come first. Not necessarily this specific Lenormand deck, but Lenormand in general came before the other deck. But I did not start reading Lenny until 2019, and I do absolutely love a good Lenny reading, particularly the grand tableaus. I absolutely love a good grand tableau. You can see that this deck is pretty much in order. I don't know why 34 is out of order. Generally speaking, when I do a grand tableau, I guess I should just put these up here. I will sometimes put these ones down so that I can see the house and then put the deck that I'm reading with over top, because there is a method of reading grand tableaus where not only do you interpret it like where it is positioned in the grand tableau as a whole, but you can also do an interpretation where you couple what house the card lands in to further give meaning to the card and the situation and the question. So if I'm doing one like that, I will often put this deck down so that I have this nice little title here, just so I don't have to think about which house should be where as I'm doing it. I really should probably buy one of the Lenormand reading cloths that has the houses printed on the cloth, but my favorite deck to use is a little on the bigger side, and I don't know that that would work. So if I'm wanting to do a reading like that, if I'm doing a really in-depth, because there's different layers you can do to a Lenormand reading, which I really love. So you can do a grand tableau and it can take you, maybe 10 or 15 minutes if you're looking at just certain parts of the grand tableau. But honestly, if you lay out and you're looking at all the different aspects in the grand tableau, and you're looking at what house they fell into as well, if you're doing house backtracking and everything, a Lenormand reading can take quite a bit of time. And I know readers, and I have done this myself too, where I will leave the reading laying out. I don't do this often because, small living space with children and everything, I don't really have a good place to leave them lay out. But I have done that where I've left the reading layout overnight and I go back to it the next day and just keep pulling more and more out of the reading. Sometimes what I'll do, because I can't really leave them lay out overnight, is I will take a picture of the whole tableau, and sometimes I'll revisit the picture the next day. But I absolutely love doing grand tableau Lenormand readings. They are one of my favorite readings to do. And honestly, my sister-in-law kind of wanted, she uses pendulums, but she wasn't really connecting with tarot. And so when she and her husband came out to visit last year, no, I think it would have been 2021, I think, that they came out to visit. Wow, I can't believe time flies. So I was showing her Lenny and a grand tableau and everything. because maybe that might be what would resonate with her. And we had a lot of fun just laying out a grand tableau and then really digging into it. It was a blast. All right, still in 2019, I picked up the Crow Tarot. Now, this is the mass market edition put out by US Game Systems. I know that the creator was not happy with, I'm not sure if she wasn't happy with the way the mass market deck turned out or how she was treated by US Game Systems. I do follow her on social media, and I know she had said that she would not do another mass market deck again after this, that she would stick to doing indie decks, which is how this deck started out. But she did wind up doing the Urban Crow Oracle through Hay House. And I do believe there's at least one more of her decks that's coming out as mass market. So I think that maybe going with a different publisher, she's changed her mind on that. But this deck, for me, first of all, this deck is gorgeous. This deck replaced my Tarot of the Hidden Realms as my workhorse deck for quite some time. I used it for both private and professional readings for quite a while. But this deck, why I wanted to put this in my tarot timeline is, you know, sometimes people think that we tarot readers, like, we just do this for others and we don't believe in this stuff ourselves or use this stuff. Why will this card not look like it's straight? Anyhow, that we don't walk our talk. I do walk my talk. I do read for myself. I do use it in the same way that I use it for clients. And this deck was pivotal in my personal life because, as I've mentioned, I do have a husband. My husband is not into the woo-woo stuff, right? But even though he would never pick up a deck and read himself, even though he would never go to a reader and get a reading, on a rare occasion, he will have something in his life / our lives that he will be like, you know what, go read on this for me. And so back in like 2017, we had talked about moving west. Now, at that time, we lived in Western Pennsylvania and we wanted to move to Washington State because I just had this thing that I resonated with that. I had never been here to Washington State, but for a long time, I had felt like this was where I was meant to be. And so in 2017, we were kind of talking and planning that we might move out here, but that didn't pan out at the time. We actually wound up moving to the town of Washington, Pennsylvania, instead of Washington State, right? So then in 2019, that was all in 2017. So in 2019, we're living in Washington, Pennsylvania, and my husband was at work and he was calling me because he didn't really have anything to do at the moment. And we're chit-chatting. He's like, you know, I've really been thinking about that moving west thing again, blah, blah, blah. You know, how about you do a reading on it? So I was like, well, we don't have like the kind of money saved that we would need for that, blah, blah, blah. I really don't see how it would be physically possible, yada, yada, yada. And he's like, well, we just read them. I was like, yeah, sure. I'll pull a few cards and see what they say. So the cards are like, yes, it is absolutely possible and very likely that you are going to move to Washington State. And not only are you going to move to Washington State, but it's going to be in less than a year. So I call my husband back and I'm like, okay, so here's what the cards say. I do not see how this is feasibly possible. I mean, like, if we wanted to do it and we started saving now, maybe in 2 years or so, but I do not see how we are going to move to Washington State in under a year. I cannot remember what month I did the reading in, but I'll say it was within 2 to maybe 3 months at the most. My husband got a promotion in his job 1 week, and then the next week there was no work. So we wound up, the company has since been bought out. It no longer exists as it was. It doesn't even do the exact same thing anymore. Because somebody else completely bought them out. And we had kind of, like, part of the reason why he was asking me about this was because I had kind of seen the writing on the wall. I had looked into, like, things that, you know, financial analysts and business things were saying about his company. And, you know, basically, like, I saw the writing on the wall that this company wasn't going to last. We had talked about him maybe trying to look for something else and switch, blah, blah, blah. So week A, he gets a promotion. Week B, he no longer has a job. So we took his severance pay and moved to Washington State. So not only was it within under a year, but it was probably, I'd say it has to have been in under 6 months from the time I did the reading until we actually packed everything we could fit into our Ford Explorer and drove cross country to move to Washington State and start anew here. So this deck is extremely pivotal to me because this is the deck that I used to do the reading that predicted us relocating here to Washington State very accurately. So now we are up to 2020, and this is the Cigány Kártya. This again is a completely different method of reading cards. Maybe I can do 2 rows in this. It's its own flavor in that it's not Lenormand. It's not an oracle like we think of most oracle decks. It has its own spreads and meanings. This is, again, I'm not sure if I said this already or not, but this is a Hungarian deck. There is is it Sibylla or Sibylla? I can't remember off the top of my head. That version of the deck. And then there is the Hungarian version, which is what I have because it is near and dear to my heart because of my heritage. And so this is just, it's a very special deck to me. I did not care for the backs of the decks, so I rebacked the deck and I cut the borders off too, because if you know me, I generally speaking do not like borders on decks. And the back has to look good as well. I talked about that in my tarot invitation video of how important the backing on a deck is for me. So these I rebacked and I trimmed the borders off of. So these are a little smaller than they come normally. I do have, just because this deck, I've seen it available and then not available and available and not available. So I have this deck, this copy of it that I modified, and then I do have just stored in case I ever need it. I have an untouched copy of this deck so that hopefully I will always have it, just because I have seen it go that it is available and then isn't available. But I absolutely love to read with this. It's pretty literal. It's pretty straight to the point. I've heard people refer to Lenormand as, you know, like tarot is kind of soft and, you know, it gets all esoteric and it can get all metaphorical and everything, whereas Lenormand is more like, you know, being hit with a hammer. It's very blunt and direct. This deck is very much like that too. And, you know, I can't label all Hungarian people, but I can tell you that the Hungarian family that I have are all very blunt and direct. So it just really feels like family to me when I read with this particular deck, because it will just call you out. It will call a spade a spade. It does not care about your feelings. It will just tell it to you like it is. And that is very much that part of my family. So it is, this deck is like family for me. I love it so much. It's some of my favorite readings to do. And I do very frequently offer readings with this professionally in my shop because I love it so much. All right, so this brings us to 2022. This is the last deck that I'm going to show, but as of 2022, I started creating some of my own decks. Now, I have created and printed 3 so far. 2 of them are very much for my own personal use. They were specifically created by me to use with very specific readings that I do. If you've ever had a what are they thinking or what are they feeling reading from me, then you have seen one of those decks. And if you get past life readings with me, you have seen the other. The first one is channeled messages, and the second one is causes of death for past lives. But this deck I created in general. I did have it for sale for a little while through the company I have it printed through, but they have changed their shipping origin location. And I feel like it takes way too long now to get the decks directly through them. So at some point here, hopefully in the near future, fingers crossed, I'm going to order a bulk amount of them, and then I will sell them either through my Etsy shop or through my website. This deck will be available because I've had a lot of people express interest in this deck. But I absolutely am obsessed with coffee. I love coffee. It is one of my favoriteest things. And so I was doing some readings that were food themed. I was using is it the Foodie Tarot? I can't even remember the name of the food deck right now. But I was using a food themed tarot deck. I was using the tea leaf cards, and then I also have the Green Witch Oracle, which has a lot of herbs and that in it. And I have the Field Guide to Garden Dragons, which also has fruits and vegetables and things in it. But since I love coffee, I do drink tea, but coffee is my favorite. It is my go-to. And I started looking for a coffee-themed oracle deck, and I couldn't find one, so I created my own. And I love, love, love it. It is a favorite of mine. Yes, I am biased because it is my baby and I created it. But I absolutely love this deck. And I have shown it to a few people who are also readers. They were very interested in it as well. I've had a lot of people say that if I did put it up for sale again, that there were a lot of people interested in purchasing it. So the way I feel is best to do that is probably just for me to order several copies, and then when they get here, I can start selling them. And then the shipping from me will be much more reasonable than from the company itself. So it will take a while because I have to place the order. I have to wait quite an extended amount of time to get the order. And then I will put them up for sale once I have them. This card will not be in the deck that is for sale. Just because even though I do have the copyright to use that image, the company that I go through doesn't really like it. And so rather than have the argument of whether or not I'm actually allowed to use that image in my deck, I just exclude it from the sale version of the deck. But that is my coffee deck. I'm excited. I have more decks that I'm working on. And I'm super excited for those. I am a creative person, so the whole process of creating decks is something that I am really enjoying and really loving and want to do a lot more of in the future. So those are the, I guess, most memorable points in time on my personal tarot timeline. Don't forget to go and check out Ethony's video if you haven't seen it already. And until I see you again, my lovelies, blessings to you wherever your journey finds you.